case, I'll
Hooray, it's planning!
It's his favourite meeting.
Not necessarily. It is.
Right. Well, we'll kick off with some apologies for absence, and the only one is from Councillor Humphreys, present at our earlier meeting. So do we accept his apologies?
Yes.
Representations of interested parties. There are no interested parties in the room, and I'm not aware of any representations in writing or otherwise. So rapidly on to declarations of interest. Any disclosable pecuniary interests?
No.
Any other interests? Minutes of the previous meeting have been circulated. That was the one held on the 5th of March. Present myself, both Councillor Oakes, Councillor Fuller, Councillor Humphreys, Councillor Chesser and Councillor Robinson. It was a full house. Do I have any proposal to approve and sign? Councillor S. Oakes, followed by Councillor Fuller. All those in favour, please indicate. Good. Sign it.
I'll do the distraction. You do.
A distraction.
I'll just look.
It is a distraction.
She has got quite a voice, hasn't she?
Yeah.
What we're going to do is
Well, I've stopped
there
now.
on the outside that says
She's alright, but her voice isn't big.
Hello.
I'm just waiting.
Thank
Right.
you.
Okay.
Is that so? We can now move on to the planning applications, and we start almost where we finished off, because this one came before us
Oh, yeah.
temptingly at our last meeting, but we weren't allowed to discuss it because it wasn't really supposed to be there. But it's here now. So Sudborough House.
I'll happily go through that. Okay. Please take a look at this. This is a right, a substantial property. And here we go. That's Wood Lane. You just come past the cemetery and hang a right.
Oh, yes, I know.
And I'm just going to go down because not many people I've been up there several times.
Yeah.
You can read it. You've got the planning application in front of you anyway. So basically,
That's it. Yeah, I know the house.
right, that's the house.
Yeah.
Now this was the problem. Now there's a shared drive,
Yes.
and what happened was that the planning people weren't very happy about this application because nobody knew who owned the shared drive, and that's why it got pulled. It's going back on again, and you'll find out why in a minute. But basically, that's the shared drive, and there's our house, which is on the left. I dealt with a planning application with that. In actual fact, I got a planning application on all of those, Old Hospital and the cottage. But anyway, look, it's a substantially sized place, and it's, you know, it's not in it's not in a conservation area or anything like that. There's a satellite picture of it. You can see it sort of bottom right. A considerable amount of land attached to it, and they do intend to do quite a lot of landscaping for this. But again, you can see the shared drive up that way. But then we get into the interesting bit. There we go.
So,
This is what they're proposing to do. Now that's the current shared drive, and that's the new parking area, the new drive, and the new access. So in other words, they're no longer having to worry about the shared drive issue, because they're just
That's
going
good,
to,
isn't it?
they're just going to, but look at it. I mean, it is a substantial amount of landscaping and everything.
It's a park.
I don't propose to go into enormous amounts of detail about this, because there's quite a lot of documentation attached to it. But I mean, inherently, I would just ask the committee as to whether they feel there's anything particularly, you know, of an issue about it.
Is that, no, there isn't really, is there?
Well, I have to say, I can't find it.
Well, I still deliver oracles, and I know that very well.
So do I. I've delivered up there several times.
It's,
And I've also dealt with, dealing with our house is quite interesting as well, but that's another one.
you don't know, if whatever they do there, nobody will notice, unless you're right there.
No. They will not notice a beam. The only thing that's probably going to be inconvenient is maybe the construction process.
Yes, but that's.
But I've got no evidence that anybody's complained about that. All right? But you've got to keep your mind open about these things. I have had a look. No, nobody's moaned it yet. Right?
No objection.
Okay, so,
No objection for me.
No objection?
No objection.
No objection it is.
Hey!
yeah, well, that's a good one.
So,
Right.
19 Cotterstock
Oh,
Road,
no, we're going back.
councillors will be familiar with.
Oh,
We've
yes.
done this application before.
I've done this one to death. And I don't intend to do it
To death.
to kill it again.
Because
Because
What is it?
all they've done is they've gone, the previous application was 41 bedrooms, it's now 36. And now, here comes the bombshell.
Oh, so we don't even have to worry about it.
that's it.
Why do we need to discuss it, really?
Yeah, we
I mean,
do.
he's recommending, basically, I read the full report, it says detailed reasons given in the recommendation, but we actually know what all the reasons are. It's all to do with those overlooking traffic, parking,
Shifts
the whole 9 yards. So I didn't intend to go any further with this one, because we've already actually hammered this to death.
I'm keen that we do say something. Not that we have a
That's
lot
okay.
of debate about it, but that there is some written response that comes in. And it seems to me that arguably the response is that the reduction from 41 to 36 fails to meet all the objections that we made on the
Absolutely,
previous
yeah.
application, and therefore for the
Yeah.
same reasons
Yeah.
we
I
would
think-
object.
I think that is
Totally.
an excellent, I think that is an
They
excellent.
could bring it down a few more then. They'll come back.
Yeah, they come back.
Wasn't there about them changing
It'll go down to
shifts
34,
coming in
then
and out?
32.
So the shifts would still be as frequent, but
Yeah.
it'd just
There'll be less
it'd
shifts.
still be.
No, it's not.
Let's face it, we don't like it at all.
Well, I'm in two minds. I think it's, we need something.
Well, if they get it right,
But they could get it right. I think they've got too many
In
people.
the detailed reasons, there is observations about other elderly care facilities within Anvil. I do well, it's trying to be balanced and mitigating it. But, I mean, it's a rotten position, really, when you consider where the school is and all the other stuff.
Yeah, but what's it? Yeah. Where's it gonna? What's gonna happen to that land?
well, of course it did at one time have planning permission for 3 substantial detached houses on there, which they never pursued. So maybe if they keep thinking that they're not going to get there with this, maybe we'll see another application of a similar nature.
Flats.
Anyway,
Is it just
for
flats?
now,
Doesn't it look like Brookside?
we've renewed our objection on
Yeah.
basically the same grounds, so why don't we move on
Move on.
and have a look at 60 West Street.
Right. Well, by the way, I need to say something important. Do you know that we, for once, we don't have an application to do with trees?
I noticed that, yeah.
That's true, yes. It hadn't registered with me, but you're quite right.
I like the trees because it goes quickly.
We just refer to the trio, is there?
Right.
But we haven't got
Well, let's
one.
look at
Forgive me, I forgot about that. Okay, West Street, there it is. Everybody more or less happy with where it is?
Ish.
It's opposite the Star.
Oh, I know where it's at. Yeah.
Okay, the site is that at the moment,
Oh, that little thing we demolished, but you can't see it.
and that's what's proposed.
Oh,
It's the thing,
you won't see it, will you?
Something and nothing, in my opinion.
You won't see it.
I couldn't leap
though.
up
So
and
it's the
down.
version about building to habitable room and erection of panels.
Yeah,
So
This
that's
isn't
I
the
mean, the habitable room is basically to do with the glazed panels and doors, that's the...
Patio.
Essentially, this is not creating a new residence with the potential problems that that might have brought. This seems to be turning a space that can't be used for anything much into a usable space. I can't see any obvious reason to object unless anybody else has come up with anything.
No.
In which case, no objection.
This is good news, time-wise.
Go on, carry on.
So far, so good. Right, now we have a planning application in respect of 20 Herne Road, which when I looked at it, I thought, why haven't they just knocked it down and started afresh? Because they don't seem to be leaving an awful lot of the existing building. But anyway, let us look at it.
Right, okay, that's the application in front of you. That's where it is, just there. Now, this is
Just
the
to the back of
interesting,
my
this is the
garden.
interesting
Perhaps I
thing.
should have to, do I have
Oh,
an
if
objection? Backs onto
it's
my
within
house.
sight of your property,
Backs
perhaps
onto
another
my house.
interest, I would have thought. Well, unless you think it would
Well-
actually affect the value or
Won't
community of your
affect
property, in which case perhaps you should declare it as...
In the design and access statement, they say it will not impinge on neighbouring properties. Whether it does or not is tricky to say. But there we go, that's what we've got.
I'm trying to pictures, I've got to remember quite a lot now.
Well, I actually know it quite well. It's not particularly attractive looking by any means.
Is it
And
hard?
we'll come on to the next thing. Look, this is what they're proposing to do. And fundamentally, that's one of the things I have to put up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually said before I said
Can I?
that I think it's an improvement.
Can I just say,
Was it?
can I
It's
just
so
say,
bad,
the
it's
near
not
resident
really.
is in the house directly opposite it. And says, I think this is going to be an improvement.
Well, then,
Now,
what's the problem?
there's very little you can say, there's no objection to it.
So it turns a small house into a big house.
Yeah.
It manages the other houses on third road.
And it actually would probably balance the,
It balances the street.
It probably would balance the vernacular of the street scene.
We'll be talking about street scenes in a minute.
Oh,
Yeah.
God.
No, there are other bungalows in Herne Road. It wouldn't. It's not.
Not
It's
the
not the only bungalow.
Oh, no.
Well, no, there's all sorts of different, and in the bits and pieces, they're talking about things like ridge heights and stuff. You know, in other words, the intention is to actually make it fit in.
Can I ask you just one question? The garage goes as part of this.
Yes.
When it's all finished,
Don't want to-
where's the parking?
Off
I don't think there is a problem with parking, Emily.
They're quite big frontages, aren't they?
Yeah.
Those
I mean, I'm
bungalows?
satisfied in my own mind.
There's tons of room.
Oh, look at
Yeah.
that. There's 3 car parks. He's even got a side car.
There- there-
Two cars.
There's,
Can we look at the plan again and see if there's a garage?
No.
There to the left, just on the
Where we
left,
go?
isn't it?
Sorry, for you, I'm just trying to work out where I'm going now.
The new house, the garage is there on the left.
Yeah.
Still on the left. Ish. Yeah.
I don't have a problem with it.
Just
I
in
think
terms
actually,
of, just,
I honestly think I would agree with the person who lives opposite.
Well,
But
I
John-
can down and start again.
I haven't. Well, I thought Councillor Campbell's observation was rather funny.
Well, I
Just
mean,
knock it down and
they'll be
complete.
able to look into my garden, but I put a big shed up if I don't like it.
Plant a couple of bushes.
As long as it's not one that requires planning permission.
I'm
yeah,
sure-
sorry,
What?
just,
As long as it's not so big that it requires planning
No, it
permission.
wouldn't be. Tall and thin.
it's a temporary dwelling, you're all right.
I'm getting a distinct flavour that this is no objection.
well, the only question I have is about rendering and finish on it.
The finish.
So some of the houses that have gone up in Oundle recently have had more Germanic white
Oh.
render on them, and that wouldn't be in keeping with that
Worse
area.
would be grey
Cladding,
paneling.
cladding.
Yeah,
Mm.
so it doesn't say what the finishing would
I
on.
do apologise, I probably should have put the finishing bits up.
And is
Oh,
it,
Can you recall what they are?
Oh, I really can't remember, I've done, 11 planning applications in the last goodness sake.
yeah.
I can't remember everything.
But I could imagine
I'm trying to
if
think
it was in brick, it would be in keeping with the neighbourhood.
Because it's rendered at the moment.
Yes, yeah, but when you look at the rest of them, some of there's some quite revolting rendered things
Oh,
gone
yeah.
up in
I'm
Oundle.
just trying to
So
read it.
Nothing that says rendering there.
It says-
Hang on, let's got it there.
Render finish to all elevations, cream or light neutral.
Oh.
Fabricated aluminium doors and windows, dark grey. Fabricated aluminium and glass, Juliet balcony,
That's at the back.
that's at the back. Obscure glass, oak posts. Looks
Okay.
all right to me.
so it's cream rendered then.
Yep. Pointing to that.
That doesn't feel like it's in keeping with that road, but
Yeah, but
Yeah, but it's not a
there's a
conservation.
lot of different houses down that road.
They're all different.
There's
You've got
some that are
red,
rounded,
you've got-
some that are
You've got all
brick.
sorts of different houses down
There's
there.
no pattern.
Hmm.
I don't think it matters.
I don't think it's obvious that it would kind of stand out as
It's not
one
like
of
a
the
I
source.
think it will. It'll
You think
stand
it
out
will?
massively.
Well, you've got that big house at the end, right opposite PWS, that's all.
Well, I can't complain because mine's white.
These white rendered houses.
Yeah, but it's difficult
All
to see yours, isn't
Mine's
it?
white and huge, it's white.
Well, it is, but
Yours doesn't,
it
you
is
can't see
pretty
yours.
unobtrusive,
It is,
despite
isn't
being on the top of quite a bit of
Yeah.
a slope and all the rest of it.
Very unbelievable.
Anyway, we're not talking about Councillor Chess's house.
No,
Well, as we are, but we shouldn't be. Does anybody have a problem with this render? Because that seems to be the only possible issue. We do need to be careful about this, because I think all of us probably instantly think of a particular house on Glapthorne Road,
I'm
which
just-
looked
I'm just
fine
about to
when we
mention that.
saw it as a line diagram, and in the flesh, so to speak, it stands out like the proverbial sore
It's,
thumb, and
yeah.
it would be a shame if this ended up doing so.
plastic grass.
No,
Should we put something like
this
with
is-
regard to the vernacular of
This
the
is,
road? Or
this is
something?
Dallas on Blackthorn Road.
There's a lot of big houses.
Oh.
It doesn't
I must admit, I was absolutely shocked when it went up, because I went through that planning application to the very best of my ability. I got no idea that it was going to end up looking like that.
So, just make a comment that we accept the cream or neutral rendering. If they painted it blue or pink or something like that, it would be horrible. But if they say it's going to be cream or neutral, we accept.
That's what
I
it
suppose
says.
the point is, cream is likely to be less obtrusive than brilliant white,
Yeah.
or indeed, as you say, blue or any other
Yeah.
colour.
It-
So perhaps we should say that we are
Well, and it's
anxious
cream
that the
already.
appearance shouldn't result in the new property kind of dominating the street scene in its immediate environs, but that we anticipate that the proposed cream stroke neutral render
Yes.
should ensure that that isn't the case. Some sort of observation along those lines.
That sounds pretty good to me.
Happy with that.
But I mean, it does say quite specifically, render finished all elevations, cream or light neutral.
And they're just reinforcing it, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, and that's a bit
Or
condition of the planning.
maybe we can say we're very pleased that being sensible.
Right, let's move on. 14A Marketplace,
Don't-
the erection of a new store building.
That's not going to be good.
Right,
Gosh, they know.
now this is where I defer to my councillor wife.
Okay, so I visited the property,
Well done.
rather gifted. I met the man from there.
Yeah.
He took me down the side. So this is the old Norman's passageway,
Yeah.
All right.
And he told me that the people who now live at the back, that there's a property, you know, Val, down that passageway, which must go above the shop,
Yeah.
rather gifted.
I
They're the
do know
people,
them, yeah.
they're the people who own that property. Then at the bottom, there is a cottage. I don't know where old Mr and Mrs Norman used to live, but at the bottom of that passageway there's a cottage.
There is.
And the people who run Dexter's live there,
All right. So it's all
right?
interesting.
Yeah. So the idea is that the people who you know who live above, rather gifted,
Yes.
are going to put a storeroom there. They were going to put electricity in it, and Mr rather gifted wants to store a lot of his goods in there because it could be very dry, and that's why
He's
they're
had that problem with the humidity, hasn't he?
yeah, so that's what it's about. So he's tentatively got an agreement with the people who own the property
Yeah.
and that he can store his goods in there.
I can see the logic.
I can, yeah. And it's not going to impact.
You had to close
There
the
was
stock
a
shop,
what was
didn't
it? A refrigeration unit and stuff.
There was a
They're
fridge
not putting any of
to
that
the
in.
right.
It's just
There's
a
going to be
store.
no fridge, because one of the things I was concerned about, as when I read it initially, is that might be a noise issue.
Yeah, I said
And
that
they're not
too.
putting a fridge in there, they're just going to put two storage areas in. I mean, I've just taken some extracts from the access statement. It was well,
It's just an empty space.
it was just well, effectively demolished. Now, here we go. Remain as usual. occasional store, a proposed ridge height will also be per the original building. And important bit here is that the existing access is to remain unchanged, so that 40A and 18 can get to their property.
You won't notice a difference with it.
Sorry?
What did I say, because it's down the passageway on the left.
You'd never see it,
No.
No.
unless you, well, you would if you went down there, but...
So the people who you know who own it want it so they can
Yeah.
use it, and then
I don't have a problem with it.
because they're all Pally, I guess, because you've got
Yeah, they're all quite
Gifted, you've got
close, yeah.
Dexter's, they're all
Yeah.
They all know each other.
They all know each
you'd
other.
have to live together.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's
And we got, I think we
I don't
support
know.
our traders.
Does it?
It's only
Well,
about
sure.
whether it's a listed building
Well,
or not.
that my thought was,
well, it's in the
In the
conservation area.
it's
conservation area.
clearly in the conservation area, and it might impact on where listed buildings are. I wonder whether this is one of those ones where, although it's not obvious, we should say no objections subject to the view of the
I
conservation.
think so, definitely.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
precisely.
I'm sure that Lloyd won't have a problem with this one.
If anything, it's going to just be a simple thing rather than what it was.
Yeah, but we'll get them in.
Well, also though, I mean, it actually renders an area usable instead of being
Unusual.
unusable.
Yeah. And if it improves the amenity of commercial businesses in the centre
Well,
of
well,
town, then in principle, one would like to support it.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
Right. Let's move on to 15 St Peter's
By the
Road.
way, so that, by the way, that is what it's going to look like, and as you can see, you've got basically two stores. But there's no refrigeration going in there, there'll be electricity going in there.
Electricity, that's all.
And that's mainly for, obviously, heating purposes, because the kind of stuff that the gift shop sells is a bit susceptible to damp.
These are a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, he's had loads, because that's quite unusual, isn't it? Like,
I like him, he's a nice.
Can I just say,
On we go.
well, next, where are we now?
15 St Peter's.
oh, this is,
Oh, crikey, right. Over to you, Chairman.
Work your way through what's on the screen first,
I will.
and then I
Be
will
delighted. But I mean, we can
explain
see
one or two things in
what we
relation
got
to this.
What we got is an infill plot. It's as simple as that, right? But it's quite a substantial house they want to put on here. Now, here we go.
Well, it's a new road.
It's a 4-bedroom dwelling with off-street parking for 3 vehicles, and they would be actually at the front of the building. The access into the house itself is down the side, which
Is that
is
those
steep.
rugby pitches?
No.
Here we go. So you can see your 3 parking spaces to the left. You can see the front door down the bottom. Don't know what else to say. I can't make it any clearer, unfortunately. I'll just go now to the next bit, and then I'll leave it to my chair to
Nice down there.
talk to about it. Okay, so you're looking at lounge dining room. Well, you can read it.
Is it this bit here? That's not that bit. is it?
It's coming.
Is it that bit?
Just a second, but there's the street
Next
scene.
door to where I used to live.
Here's your street scene, right? So you can see where the proposed new house is going to be, shoehorned in between.
Don't like that, not down there.
Right, that's that bit. Site photos.
Oh, right, that's better.
Now you can see what we're at now.
That's there, isn't it? It's that one, is it?
You can see that I tried, well, I pulled off fairly, ones,
Was it now?
and you can see what we're proposing.
David says it.
And let me just check. I think that's where I've got to. So over to you, Chairman.
I'm rather familiar with this.
I bet you are.
If you look at the top left-hand picture,
yeah.
That's your house.
the house on your right was where I lived for 30 years.
Oh, so you know this is...
The present property on the other side of the picture, the owner of that property, who's now been there for some years, did at one time bring forward a very similar planning application at a point at which I was living next door to him.
This is Mr. Cross.
This is Paul Cross. And there were objections to it from myself amongst a number of others on both sides of the road. And essentially the objections were that it would impact fairly severely on the street scene. The properties on that side of the road, by and large, are built on plots that were at least a plot and a half to 2 plots. And although that photograph does make it appear as if there's quite a big gap between the 2 properties, actually, if you filled it with a property, it would
We've done the satellite view.
completely alter
Overdevelopment, I think, is the
the appearance of that side of the road.
That's
That's not
right.
true, that isn't a true
Yeah. So
picture, I don't think.
when you look at that, the problem in a sense is that if you looked along the entire street from the top of the hill down,
Yes.
this would stand out, again, to use that phrase yet again, like a bit of a sore thumb, because in practice it destroys the spacing that currently exists. That was the basis on which neighbours objected to it previously, and in fact the application was withdrawn before it ever got to being debated by this council, at which point I would have had to excuse myself for obvious reasons. And it's lain dormant for many years, but clearly is now being brought back. Now, I don't know whether any of the neighbours have yet objected. I would be surprised if there weren't some objections, because some of the people who objected before are still resident in the area, for example.
I did check, I couldn't find
Yeah.
any.
If you go further down the hill, the next house, they certainly objected, and of course the people on the other side of the road objected as well.
It's very nice.
Now, admittedly, for example, more or less opposite that, there is a house on the other side of the road which has been substantially extended, but it's one property that's now that much bigger and doesn't look out of place because a lot of the properties have been extended. Indeed, the property I used to live in used to be like the one on the left-hand side.
And that's been extended then quite a lot.
And it was extended and extended. When we bought it, the extension on the right-hand side existed. But on the left-hand side, there were a pair of garages and nothing over the top. And probably 30 years ago or so, we actually had 2 rooms built over the top, converted the garages, and in fact built a garage on the far side of the property. And that, in a sense, has been the pattern of development in that street, because several properties have been extended in a similar fashion. It backs on to the Cotterstock Road / St Peter's Road development site that we spend so much time talking about in neighbourhood plan meetings. But that would be my concern about it,
It's just
as somebody very familiar with it. Now, maybe it would be as well to see whether other people share that concern, because it may be that because I used to live there, I am more sensitive to this than other people, although I noted that Councillor Fuller was making a very similar comment about it before I even started, and has now got up an image of it.
It was just, it's what happened with New Road. They filled in too many houses in New Road, and it's spoiled New Road a lot. And my son does the annual advertiser down that road. So we're doing a lot of walking up and down there lately. And I just think, we talked about the street vernacular, won't we? I think it will be a massive eyesore, because it's a lovely road, that one. I think you'll have loads of objections to it anyway.
I think so too.
I don't think I can't see it fitting in there, can you?
Well, when you look at
the satellite,
Davies
that's wrong. That's giving it in, that's not a very good.
So it's not having a garage at all? It's
This
just
property.
parking on the
It would
front.
appear not. I mean, at the moment, there is a gravelled area on which cars are parked, but there is no garage that's going to be associated with this. So, I mean,
Yeah.
on that photograph that you just saw a minute ago, you can see parked cars.
There.
But they would have to be parked immediately in front of the building.
It's got three
It doesn't
parking,
make sense, does it?
there's no garage, there are 3 parking spaces that are proposed.
No, there isn't. It's just
That is what the proposal is.
Yeah.
I can only,
there's
I
no
can only
room on
say,
either side, to be honest.
No, personally, I don't think that parking idea fits in that road.
I don't know.
It makes it look industrial,
Yeah.
you know, it's just not in keeping with the road, and therefore as a development it needs to go back.
It's, yes, I mean, I perhaps should have observed as well that when we built the garages on the far side of the property, if you like, and converted those, the planners were very keen that cars were parked on the new drive or in the garages,
Yeah.
rather than in front of
Yeah.
what was then
Yeah.
living accommodation.
It's a very nice street, though.
So it's overdevelopment in my view.
Yeah,
I
it
think
is.
Yeah.
If that's a
So they
genuine-
could put a property on there that looks like number 15, the same style as 15, garage, yeah, because it looks like there's not space to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
You know, the basic property, and
But
it would
it's not a
keep
big
it,
enough site. is it,
garden
for
at the front of the house and all the stuff.
proposed-
You see number 15 in that picture
Yeah.
there, you could just
Mm.
plonk that alongside it. It will all be in keeping. You've got a little garage alongside it, it all be balanced. But as it is there, with 3 cars stuffed in front of it, it just looks like an industrial
It just wouldn't do it.
Looking at this, it would be the only house with all the cars sitting outside.
Does that? I doubt.
Is that right,
I'm
David?
just suspicious of the route.
To be fair, not entirely. I mean, there are other properties where cars do
Well, is
park.
that-
Indeed, where
Next to your.
we used to live, the people who purchased the property more often park it on what I'm going to call the old drive than park it on what I'm going to call the bottom drive, if you like.
Yeah.
But even so, I mean, when there is no other option but to park it like that, that's a slightly different scenario than people choosing to park it there because it's right next to the front door. I don't get an awful lot of feeling that this is
No,
supported.
it's going to be tight, isn't it?
So I think the objection is in effect overdevelopment and the impact on the
Yeah.
street scene.
Yes.
Most definitely. It's a very nice street. Isn't it?
So
It's not like
objection.
every once in a while there might be 3 cars for a christening or something, is it? If they're,
Well, it's
if
obviously
they're
going to be
starting out putting 3
it's
cars
a
on the
significant sized property, so
Yeah.
the chances are there will be at least 2.
Yeah.
I defer to Councillor Chappell with his obviously intimate knowledge of this, but there's an awful lot of houses down this road that are completely different. There's an absolute, there is not a...
It's not the diversity of the development.
No,
It's the amount of space between the property.
No, I agree. No,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to say that Home Road have got lots of different properties.
Yeah.
And this, area have got a lot of different properties.
They've got the spacing on that
But
side.
I think your observation that, well, I'm not very happy with it, so
It's too tight.
Okay.
all I can do is put up what
Oh, I
I said
know.
in the planning application.
That's
Okay.
fair enough.
I'm going to suggest we move on because I think it's clear
Yeah,
enough.
let's go
I
back.
might
What are we
help
going
you
to
write
say?
that one up a bit
What are
more.
we going to say? Basically, we don't like it.
So we'll say that it appears to be overdevelopment. There is an adverse impact on the street scene, and having vehicles parked immediately in front of the property would not be desirable. And there's nowhere else where they could park other than on the street, which is not an ideal alternative. Right, 27 Bennyfield Road.
This is quite interesting, actually. There it is.
Hello.
Well, it's not little, it's quite big.
Good.
And, don't know what to say, really. I mean, the grey area is what is intended to be put on it. There's your plan and elevation.
So you're going to build a little house on the side of the house, are
No, it's going to be a work study.
Study.
It's basically just going to be a study. It's more or less as a kind of shed.
Yeah,
But it's a rather permanent shed.
they?
and detached entirely from the main
It
dwelling.
is detached.
Which is weird.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, why
Unfortunately,
can't they attach it to the house?
Well, I mean, there is a precedent, because actually if you think back to the previous application at number 15, Mr Cross has his summer house, which he also works in.
Oh,
And it's detached entirely from the main property, but he uses it like a kind of an office. So I'm sure it's not unique.
Is it going to fill that street in there? Because I know what it's like there. I mean, it depends how you feel about it. Don't have nursery section. Oh, there's lots of space next to it though.
I mean, look, it's in respect of the actual, area itself. It's the biggest site within that sort of small run of houses
Yes,
by a mile. We happen to know the people who live in Bramley House, which is the one at the top left of the
Oh, I see.
the other drive. We know them very well, but we don't have to care because we don't have an interest in it. But
Well, I would have to do the same if we were going down that route.
It's
No, it's
Yeah,
fine.
the recess.
it's the that's Christian.
It's fine.
Aren't there quite a few trees on the...
No, no.
Hmm.
You've got that little road that goes up to that little
Yeah,
street.
it's quite wooded around there.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't see it.
I thought it was somewhere else.
Mm.
It's not going
I mean, it's
opposite
outside the
field,
conservation area, it's
It
far
is.
enough out to be outside the conservation area. I don't think,
but- No.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any of that run of properties are listed, because there
I
are
thought
some
it was
listed
further up.
ones in Belleville Road, but I don't think it's there.
No, it's fine.
So it's not an impact on something of that nature. And to be honest, although
No, it's
I
fine.
don't
It's a
think
little
that it
road.
would detract to such an extent from the amenity of other properties or anything else that I could really find a reason for saying no.
And that is a field there.
Yes. I thought it was
On the other
further
side
up
of
when
the
it gets all
field.
very property. This is at the beginning,
Yes.
after Milton Road, where it's still pretty...
Well, yeah, there are some grade twos on Benefit, but I must confess I didn't check this one out.
No, all
I
right. I'm happy with it.
it's not a crowded site.
That's Miller's Field, isn't it?
Miller Seals is beneath the allotments.
It's nice.
I
Don't see a problem.
I struggle with this one really.
I get the distinct impression there's no real objection to this, so
No.
no objection. Let's move on to Cobthorne,
Ah,
which we may have noticed is a listed building.
oh yes.
Ever so slightly. It's one of the-
Like grade
it's
one
of
listed.
It's one of 4 grade 1 listed buildings in our lovely town.
Which makes us a bit, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Oh, this is quite. I love this. All I've got to say to you is, if you've got to have a chance, go and have a look at the historical assessment that's been done. And I don't intend to put that up because it's quite long.
It's amazing.
And if you want to look at it, I mean, there we are. And you can see the 2 planters at the front.
Yes, they want to replace it.
Yep. They want to get rid of them. Now, I don't intend to go into an enormous amount of detail about this. I'm just going to show you the proposal.
Ooh. Because they've got
Very
shapes
grand.
of cars. Yeah, I think it looks nice. Myself.
It'll make it look posh.
I think it looks very posh.
Have you been?
I've been in there a couple of times, 3 times, number of times. The thing is that it'll make it a very imposing entrance. But interestingly, reading through the enormous number of documents on this one, mainly to do with historical background, one of the reasons I do this is because they're not very happy about people going and parking in
Yeah.
there.
Yes, the police even have gone and sat in, parked in there eating their sandwiches.
People park it, it's comfortable.
Yeah, people sit on, well, they,
The trouble is, I like it being open. I don't like, we've got too many blinking fences everywhere in Amble. When the school put all those fences around the boarding houses, I didn't
It
like
must be annoying as well when people
And
sit
I
on the wall
just-
to eat their lunch.
Yes.
The school have been very keen to put railings up all over the place.
Well, that's rubbish.
Historically, years and years ago.
It would have looked like that.
It
It,
did
yeah,
have those
it would have looked like that.
But I like it open,
I know.
and it should be.
Sorry.
Although,
To be honest, I thought it was, I didn't realise they had the fencing. I have a problem with the fencing. But that's a personal I'm not going to object, but if nobody else is objecting, but I don't like that. Because you're going to have this wall. The nice thing is you go past the Italian, you go past Beauty of the Roof, you get a little bit of an open space, Cawthorne, and then you hit the ship, and then it's basically whoop, all the way down, nothing. And this was just going to give you that feeling of enclosed. That's the only thing I'll say. I just don't like unnecessary fencing, so I've got to think about it.
or maybe they could actually just keep the piers and get rid of the railings.
Well, I don't mind them doing the other bit. I just don't like the railings. I don't think they need it. It should be open. It's an important building in Amble. I think it will lose some of that.
Hang on a minute, Nicholas Pevsner says it's the most important building.
Whoever said it, but well, it is unique because of its.
I thumbed through Nicholas Pevsner.
It's the in between two different design styles, isn't it?
It will result, not more than that.
It's because of its
Cool.
Right, let's get this meeting.
Civil War.
Yeah,
I
All right.
don't like it.
Off.
So, Councillor Fuller has an issue with it. It's an issue I understand because I slightly share your reservation about the idea of there being railings up, because I value the current openness
I
of
do.
it very much, as Councillor Fuller said. But it would, I suppose, be possible to make the observation that we would prefer that railings were not included within
Yes.
the revisions to the front, but would otherwise defer to the view of the conservation officer,
Exactly.
who, let's face it, is going to have a fairly strong
Lloyd.
view about
Yes,
this.
and
Lloyd,
possibly
Lloyd.
let them-
And he might well be
I
unhappy
don't
with
think
it
it'll
for
be-
precisely the same reasons as
It's
some
supposed to
concerns have been
Lloyd
expressed.
is the council officer
Yes.
as well.
It will spoil the frontage.
I mean, one of the things I possibly would say is maybe it might be railing height that might be an issue.
Yeah, I think.
I just don't
agree.
think
In other words, if they dropped it
If
a
they're not
bit.
too high, then it might.
So, in other words, it's
So making cities a bit painful.
no, but that's about the only design observation I can make. To say that's a grandiose statement, that, isn't it?
But the railings are only decorative, aren't they?
It's
Because the,
not
gate,
there for any purpose.
because the gate is permanently open, there's no gates on there.
Oh, yeah.
I wondered if that railing was set back the other side of the new planted area.
No.
So it's not on the curb side, it's on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're back into the sort of planters that we're used to. Yeah, whether that would actually be less imposing. But say go back to the railings are only there for decorative purposes.
It's,
And if
well,
they're not,
the objection I have is it's Amble School saying, get out. Is what they did was say,
Fair
no,
building.
don't matter. I just don't like the fact that the school have shut out parts of its land to the town, which is understandable from their perspective, but actually it's a sort of get off my land, and I don't like it.
I think this is one where, it being the most significant building in the entire town, it's worth actually going round and asking everybody individually.
Yeah.
Because I've written down that we were going to not have any objection subject to the removal of the railings and the view of the conservation officer, but I'm not absolutely convinced that that's necessarily the feel of the entire meeting. So if I could start with Councillor Oakes-End.
To be honest, I don't like what is the potential railing height is the bit where I'm coming from. If you look, you've got two biggish pillars. That railing height, and by the way, there's not a measurement on the plans I've seen as to how high it will be actually. Am I wrong?
well, there is a measurement on that,
There
just about the
is,
middle of the
isn't it?
page.
It's an exceed elevation.
Can't read what it is, but you can see it.
Oh, there it is, yeah. Can't see it there.
Well, there's a legal height limit anyway.
Is it?
I'm
Well,
sure
it would be, but it's 6 foot, so.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll be,
And we certainly wouldn't want a 6 foot.
it's a very,
No, well,
Fencing in
so
front of
that's
them.
something we can say, that
it's a very
I'm not
decorative.
sure I'd be very happy with 5'6" for that matter.
It's very decorative railing. It's got all those little things.
does it say what the height is, Neville?
I'm trying to find it. I do apologise. I should have worked out this. I've got it somewhere.
Don't take the railings, I've got off the
Anyway, I'm trying to find me Zoom.
Do they look like that? One on the left, you know, the second diagram down.
Actually, you can't
Where
read
it
those.
says, but on their hip,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
I've got the
Do you know what word would be the, what you were saying?
the piers
So
are,
we need some chains.
2500?
yeah,
Chains would be much nicer.
so the 2.5 metres,
Low,
the
low
piers.
level, yeah.
It's just the view.
So there'll be, the railings will be about 1
9
3/4,
feet,
something like that.
8 feet or something.
How big?
2.5 metres.
If that's
3
really
metres
that
is
height,
6
then
feet plus
No, I
half.
don't want
I feel
It's
even more
definitely-
strongly about
7.5
it.
feet, much too high.
If that's that.
It's definitely,
No,
Get off
I've
my
gone
lane.
against it.
Yeah.
you've got to see Cobthorne. You won't see
I,
it.
I think
There was an
because
object to the height.
all those years ago, it had railings, and that's what they're going back to.
Yes, but
And
they
the
don't.
railings probably were taken away for the war to make
Makes a bit of
Spitfires,
sense, quite possible.
Spitfire.
ammunition.
As well,
Well, the
some
house
of my-
further up, what was a hotel for a time, and it's now offices, just further along. They had railings.
Yeah,
well, a lot of railings were chopped.
Yes,
down.
but-
They still
For-
have
for
railings.
munitions,
So
yeah.
this probably had railings once upon
And I think
yeah,
times
it says
I
it
think-
did, it says it in the history if you read it.
I don't like that. No, you're going round, aren't you?
You're going
Well, I was going to go
Far.
I was
round,
trying to have a bit of order.
You said no.
but I didn't really get beyond Councillor Oak's end, unfortunately.
You said no.
What am I saying? I don't like height.
No, I don't like the railings. No.
You know,
I don't like the railings.
I like them. I think they're very elegant, but I don't like them to be so high. I think they should be more sympathetic, if you like, to...
can we propose
So
chains?
Well,
They had chains. They used to have chains.
I think
What we
they
need to
did.
do is send it back to them for a
I
better
think
idea.
that perhaps, I was going to say no objection subject to, but I actually think that what we've actually got is an objection
Yeah.
Yes.
to it as it is at the moment.
Can I ask-
Because it appears that when fully implemented, that the height of the whole thing will be excessive and will stop the current openness of that site, which we value.
Yeah.
So
It will have an impact.
He's right, because following on then you've got all the ship and all those buildings, so it is nice to see that open space.
Yeah.
and in a sense, the
It is
risk
a very
is it
beautiful
ends up
house.
detracting from the
From
most
the
important building in the
Yeah,
town.
Yeah.
Because people might be looking at that more than they're looking at Copthorne, quite
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah.
Right, I think we'll slightly change that. We are going to object because of. So, the last planning application, and I don't know what it is about the St Peter's Road, Cottestott Road area of the town this week, but another application in St Peter's Road, this time at number 3, which has similarities in a sense to the one in Herne Road, because this one wants to add a first floor, front, side and rear extension, which sounds fairly dramatic.
Well, this is that one that you can't get in.
Hey,
No, I'm just thinking my page.
I know that. You know the one.
Yes, I know the
That's where
difference.
it is, and it obviously it's a big plot. And the proposal, I'll just do it as easily as I can,
First
is
floor.
that
It's an extension.
it is.
That's not that bad, actually.
Well, if you go back and have a look at the plot size and everything, you can see there's plenty of scope for it to be widened, shall we say?
That's not the same issue as the other one, is it?
No,
The difference in a sense is that this is
And
developing the existing structure as opposed to trying to slot one in between
Squeeze.
two,
Yeah.
where we might have been a bit more
Yeah.
alarmed if that was being proposed,
Absolutely.
although that really wouldn't be feasible there.
I don't have a problem with that.
But about the neighbours?
Not heard anything about them, but I have to put my usual caveat in.
You don't.
I don't necessarily know, and by the way, the planning department are clearly in a bit of a 2 and 8 at the moment, because normally you can go onto the site and you can click on and say, you know, things coming up for planning consent. And what you get is a nice little wee blue thing that says, there's a planning application on this. Now, 3 of the applications we've had on here today, they haven't put it on the map.
That might perhaps be the subject of a separate letter that maybe we ought to be writing to them to say, look, it just isn't good enough. You have to make sure that people viewing that can at a glance see whether there is or isn't an application in a particular area. Otherwise it defeats the whole object of the exercise.
Well, all you've got to do is go onto the NSE site and see if you can find, you know, a couple of these. There's no indication that there's a planning act in it.
Well, to come back to the specific one, this is, I mean, it's described as front, side and rear extension.
Well, I
In
think
terms of that property, and Councillor Fuller, if he's used to delivering on that road, will instantly recollect it, and indeed the owners tend to put, talking of chain link fences,
Yes,
they do
they
that,
do.
they
They
put
put
a
a
little
chain
chain
link
link fence
fence
across the drive, so if you want to deliver to the property you actually have to step over
That's
that,
true.
which I've done on umpteen occasions in the past.
That tripping.
But in fact, when you think about where they park, and talking about what we've been mentioning elsewhere, the parking would tend to be straight in front of the property,
Yes.
because that's the way it kind of lends itself. Now, this may make it, depending on exactly how far that front extension extends, whether it impacts on that, because you certainly wouldn't want to displace parking from there onto the road, because it's far too close to the corners. Because you would come off Bellamy Road, turning into St Peter's Road, and immediately St Peter's Road turns sharply down the hill, and that property is just on the small straight bit before you start to go onto the corner that takes you down the hill. So you certainly wouldn't want parking displaced. I do wonder a little bit whether it's overdevelopment. I mean, it's personal.
But isn't there already a place there already? Is it a first floor? Or is
So it looks like he's converting a garage into a lounge and then putting
Yes.
a bedroom above it.
yeah, pretty well, yeah.
So there's no issue with surface area, is there?
No.
So
Not
that won't
no.
affect it, it's just height. So I don't see a problem. Parking's
First
all right.
floor, front side and
You can see on the sat that there's a sort of flattened lower level thing. It's just putting on top of that, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I only highlighted the first floor.
So
Because the ground floor is already as it is.
he's not increasing it, it's even better because it's not increasing his area.
Right.
Apart from volume.
So we've certainly got slightly divergent views at the moment, because I say that I felt it seemed to me a bit like overdevelopment. Councillor Fuller disagrees with me, and I can understand. I think it is marginal, and maybe I'm oversensitive about it. What do other councillors feel?
No, I think I'm fine with it.
My difficulty is I don't know whether it's filling the entire plot widthways.
It's not increasing the width at all,
No.
because his
No,
garage.
but if it's going up as well,
Yeah.
it can make it look a lot more
Fatter.
imposing, if
Yeah.
you like, to surrounding properties.
On
In
the
terms of the surrounding properties, to the left of it,
left, it's tight
the
right now.
property, in fact, fronts Bellamy Road.
Mm.
And I think it would impact very little on that property. The property right on the corner is a sort of chalet bungalow type property, slightly set back. And I suspect this wouldn't impact greatly on that property either. It just depends on whether the end result of what is proposed is significantly substantial to make one worry about whether it amounts to overdevelopment. But as I was saying earlier, there's lots of precedent in St Peter's Road for properties being significantly extended.
It's quite well hidden up there though, isn't it?
Mm,
When
yeah.
it's not as open. If I remember right, it opens out your view of the St Peter's Road.
You have to go down, you
down
have to
there.
start going down the hill to get that sort of
So
open
round
feeling.
that
And
corner, you don't really see much. I mean, that other house, the next one above it, I didn't know it was that massive. And I've been delivering. Because I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem.
I've got a problem.
okay.
It's where it is, it makes it easier.
The consensus would appear to be no objection.
Yes.
Well, it looks, I'm just having as good a look at it as I can. It looks as though they've got plenty of, shall we call it car parking space at the front. We may not like it, but, you know.
I think if they were developing...
This is following a trend. People don't use garages anymore to put cars in. That's, they just don't. And we're getting an increasing number of this kind of application. So you can sort of see, you know, a trend in this. People are not necessarily moving. They possibly have inherited some wealth and can afford to stick something onto their beloved property. But I really can't, I'm grinding my teeth here as to whether I could really jump up and down and complain about this. Particularly given its proximity.
The consensus clearly is in favour of no objection, so I think that's what we'll record.
Yeah.
And happily, that is the last of the planning applications,
Yes.
which means that with a
Not
bit of
quite.
luck...
Not quite.
No. He's got us on.
Oh, he's got a little sting of the tongue.
Yeah, for information only.
Oh, yes.
Just looking
All
for
right.
interested.
Information only coming up.
Basically, this was on the planning side of things, but I only picked it up by sheer luck, really. So, now you know, obviously, Owen Pharmacy, they're going to be a problem with asbestos.
Yeah.
Is that the reason?
No, this is all to do with quite a large ping pong between the pharmacy and Lloyd Mills wanting to preserve the history
Yes.
of the building.
Yes.
And he insisted that there was an archaeological report.
Right.
And that's quite detailed, and it talks all about all the bits inside. But what Lloyd wanted was probably things like photographs and, you know, of how it was. In other words, you know, the story, you know, preserving the history of the place. I just thought you'd be interested.
Yes, thank you for that.
His job.
He's looking good on his job.
Yes,
Yes.
I've had a few arguments with him.
He helps us.
Anyway, that is.
Well done.
Thank you
Here
so
we
much.
go. We know
We have,
my favourite slide.
now we have reached the end. Planning outcomes are shown on your agenda.
Yes, it's all right.
Planning appeals, there are none. Now there is, actually I've forgotten this, there is one further item that's on our agenda that was put there in effect at my request. It went to full council and then it was suggested that it should come to us, which was to discuss boundary review. Now I must admit, I have looked again at that briefing note, and although my first reaction was, oh right, this is the sort of first salvo with regard to boundary reviews that would affect the parish, I actually think on rereading it, it is probably actually more opposite for boundary reviews which affect, say, East Northants area within Northamptonshire and such like. Having said that, boundary reviews will happen, and the point is that we ought to be ready for it this time in a way that we weren't ready for it last time, because last time, because we rushed it and didn't consult with our neighbours, we contrived to upset practically everybody.
Certainly.
We may yet end up upsetting people because we may yet reiterate the views that we made last time, possibly even more so in some instances. So what I would like to do is to have this item on the next agenda, and in a sense we'll keep it there until we actually get enough time to have a talk about it in principle. But what I've got in mind is that from this committee there should be an invitation to all our neighbouring parish councils to come and have a meeting with us, not necessarily the whole of the committee, but certainly perhaps at least a couple of us, simply to talk through this issue of boundary reviews so that we can understand where they're coming from, they can understand where we're coming from, I'm not sure we'll be able to square the circle. For example, we thought that Ashton Drive, although it's technically Lapston Drive, which is technically in Ashton Parish, on the old former A1 reclaim site, just the other side of the road to the riverside, is to all intents and purposes part of Arundel. Query, should we incorporate it? That would succeed in upsetting Ashton because of the impact upon them. Talk about, for example, whether the Barnwell Country Park stroke Marina area, separated as it is from Barnwell by the A605, sits more naturally now within the parish of Arundel, is another discussion to be had, let alone the discussions that we might wish to have with Blackthorn with regard to the existing development on the fringe of Arundel that is technically in Blackthorn parish but completely remote from the village itself, to the site which we keep talking about in neighbourhood planning terms, etc., etc. So I suggest we all avert our minds to it. We'll put it on the agenda for next time, but the view is, at least my view is, that we should probably hold a meeting, and probably sooner rather than later, if we can interest other councillors in coming to have a chat to us to explore this issue. Councillor Fuller.
Bearing in mind the anger that occurred the last time, and trying to be sort of nicer, would it be a good idea if it wasn't Arundel that proposed this joint meeting, but we could ask friendly councils to
I could, I suppose, raise exactly the same subject wearing a different hat in a different council, who of course have an equal interest in this issue. Clearly, in relation to boundaries between Clapthorne and Arundel, I think the only sensible thing I could do is not participate in any decisions, because clearly I would be potentially conflicted either way.
If we could ask a friendly, like John.
But
Ashton.
I can have a conversation. In fact, Blackthorn are having an emergency meeting on Thursday, which has nothing to do with anything to do with this. It's to do with their hopeful acquisition of some playing field land within the parish. But I could perhaps suggest that something
I just
put
think
on,
politically it would be better coming from
put on the agenda for there. Yes, all right. I'll explore that perhaps before we take it any further. We might want to put the idea on the next agenda so
Yes,
I
I
can
think
report
that's
back
a good
on
idea.
anything that may have emerged from my discussions
Good luck.
with Blackthorn.
Thank
Quickly round the room, I'll start there.
you.
No? No?
Thank you for another.
Well, I think we possibly, unfortunately, just crept the wrong side of 9 o'clock because I forgot that last item, but we almost made it. Thank you very much.